In some of the driest landscapes on Earth, survival depended on knowing secrets hidden inside the desert itself. Long before modern wells bottles or irrigation systems, ancient people learned how certain cactus plants could provide moisture food medicine and vital resources when water became dangerously scarce. This knowledge could mean the difference between life and death beneath a relentless sun. If you enjoy discovering the forgotten survival skills of the ancient world like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we explore how ancient people used cactus to survive without water. Long before the first written histories of the Andes, before armies marched beneath imperial banners, and before stone roads stitched the mountains together, a strange green column already stood against the dry Peruvian sky. It grew where life seemed reluctant to survive, rising from rocky slopes and desert valleys in thick, ribbed stems covered with small clusters of spines. From a distance it looked almost architectural, as if someone had planted living pillars in the earth. To the people who moved through these landscapes thousands of years ago, however, this cactus may have been far more than part of the scenery. It could be medicine nourishment, a source of practical knowledge, and under carefully controlled circumstances a doorway into experiences that seemed to cross the boundary between the human world and something beyond it. The plant, known today by several names, most famously San Pedro, belongs to a group of columnar cacti native to the Andes. Some species contain mescaline, a powerful psychoactive compound capable of altering perception, emotion, the sense of time, as the apparent relationship between a person and the surrounding world. Modern chemistry can describe the molecule, and modern medicine can observe many of its effects, but none of that tells us exactly what an ancient Andean ritual specialist believed was happening when the cactus was prepared and consumed. That part of the story survives only indirectly, scattered among carved stones, ceramic vessels, plant remains, ritual objects, and ceremonial buildings, whose original explanations vanished centuries before anyone attempted to record them. This is what makes the cactus such an unusual archaeological mystery. Ancient people did not leave a written manual explaining why it mattered. There is no surviving Chavin priest describing the proper preparation, no inscription telling archaeologists whether a vision represented a god, an ancestor, a transformation, a diagnosis, or something entirely different. Instead, researchers encounter images of cactus-like plants held by imposing supernatural figures, architecture designed to manipulate movement and sensation, and evidence that psychoactive substances formed part of ceremonial life in some of the same environments. The pieces appear to belong together, but exactly how they fit remains debated. The landscape itself provides the first clue. Much of coastal Peru is exceptionally dry, compressed between the Pacific Ocean and the towering Andes. Rivers descend from the mountains and form narrow ribbons of fertile land through otherwise barren terrain. Farther inland, steep valleys climb toward colder highlands, where altitude, sunlight, rain, and vegetation change dramatically over relatively short distances. Ancient communities living here became experts at understanding ecological zones. They knew which plants appeared on certain slopes, which crops belonged to particular elevations, where animals migrated when rivers changed, and how valuable materials could move between coast, valley, and mountain. A columnar cactus occupying this environment was therefore not simply an exotic object discovered by accident. Humans could observe it generation after generation. They could learn when it flowered where it grew most successfully, how its flesh behaved when cut, and what happened when different parts were eaten, boiled, applied, or discarded. Knowledge of a psychoactive plant does not necessarily begin with religion. It may begin with experimentation, medicine, hunger, curiosity, or an accidental encounter. Only later can repeated experience turn a useful plant into a meaningful one, and meaning in the ancient Andes was often inseparable from landscape. Mountains were not merely obstacles. Water was not merely a resource. Caves, springs, peaks, animals, storms, and unusual natural formations could participate in systems of sacred power. Archaeologists must be careful when reconstructing beliefs from later Andean traditions, because thousands of years separate many societies, yet the broader archaeological record repeatedly shows that places and natural forces carry deep ceremonial importance. A cactus capable of profoundly changing consciousness would have entered a world already filled with powerful relationships between people and their surroundings. Imagine approaching such a plant without modern pharmacology. There is no concept of receptors, neurotransmitters, or psychedelic compounds. A person consumes a carefully prepared substance, and hours later, colors become unusually vivid, patterns shift. Familiar forms seem alive, the body feels strange, distance changes, memories surface with unexpected intensity, and ordinary boundaries may appear to dissolve. In a society where ritual, illness, ancestry, whether fertility, animals, and divine forces are already deeply interconnected, such effects need not be interpreted as chemical interference with the brain. They can seem like revelation. That possibility has made the cactus especially tempting for modern interpretations of Andean art. Whenever archaeologists see distorted faces, fanged beings, serpents, hybrid bodies, or figures combining human and animal features, it is easy to attribute everything to hallucination. But that explanation can become too convenient. Religious imagery can be symbolic without being psychedelic and terrifying. Supernatural creatures do not require drugs to be imagined. Scholars still debate how much visionary experience influenced particular artistic traditions, and no single explanation fully accounts for the extraordinary complexity of ancient Andean iconography. The strongest argument, therefore, does not come from strange imagery alone. It emerges when several different kinds of evidence begin to overlap. A recognizable cactus appears in ritual art. Ceremonial centers contain spaces that seem designed to control access and sensory experience. Other psychoactive plants are associated with ritual paraphernalia. Later, Andean traditions preserve ceremonial uses of related cacti. None of these clues taken separately provides a complete answer. Together, however, they suggest that altered states were not necessarily peripheral curiosities. Under certain conditions, they may have belonged to carefully organized systems of knowledge and authority. This changes the central mystery. The important question is not simply whether ancient people discovered that a cactus could make them see unusual things. Human beings have encountered psychoactive plants in many parts of the world. The more difficult question is how such an experience becomes institutionally meaningful. How does a wild plant from a harsh landscape enter temples, images, ceremonies, healing traditions, and systems of power? Who is allowed to prepare it? Who consumes it? Who interprets what follows? And what happens when one group claims special access to experiences that others cannot easily understand? Those questions become especially powerful at Chavindahuantar, one of the most extraordinary ceremonial centers of the ancient Andes. But the cactus does not suddenly appear there without a past. Its story reaches deeper into the prehistoric landscape, into a period when communities were already moving plants, symbols, materials, and beliefs across enormous distances. Before the carved figures and dark stone galleries, there is a simpler beginning. People learning that one stubborn plant surviving among rock and dust could alter the experience of being alive. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because once that discovery entered ritual life, the cactus stopped being merely a plant. It became part of a much larger attempt to understand illness, power, death, transformation, and the invisible forces believed to shape the human world. And somewhere between the desert floor and the first great ceremonial centers of the Andes, that transformation appears to have begun. To understand why this cactus could become sacred, it helps to begin with the plant itself, not with the temples that later surrounded it. The cactus commonly called San Pedro is not a single universal form with one fixed ancient identity, but belongs to a group of tall Andean columnar cacti that modern botanists place mainly within the genus Echinopsis, including species historically known under names such as Trichocereus pashanoi. These plants are adapted to environments where survival depends on storing water, tolerating intense sunlight, and enduring long periods when rainfall is unreliable. Their thick green stems act as reservoirs. Their ribs expand and contract as moisture changes. Their waxy surfaces reduce water loss. In mountain valleys and dry slopes, a mature cactus can rise several meters above the ground, visually striking in landscapes where large vegetation may be sparse. That physical appearance alone may have helped give it importance. Unlike a small herb hidden among grasses, a columnar cactus can become a landmark. It stands upright, long-lived, difficult to ignore, and apparently capable of holding life inside itself while the surrounding earth dries. Ancient communities familiar with seasonal scarcity would have understood that such a plant possessed unusual biological resilience, even if they explained that resilience in terms very different from modern botany. A plant that remains green through drought can easily acquire associations with endurance, fertility, healing renewal, or supernatural vitality. Yet the property that makes San Pedro especially important to this story lies within its tissues. Some Andean columnar cacti contain mescaline, an alkaloid with powerful psychoactive effects. Chemically, mescaline belongs to a family of compounds that can influence serotonin systems in the human brain, particularly pathways involved in perception, mood sensory processing, and cognition. Ancient people, of course, knew none of these biochemical mechanisms. They knew only the experience. The distinction matters because modern science explains what the substance does physiologically, while archaeology must reconstruct what ancient people believed those effects meant. Mescaline does not usually produce a brief fleeting change. Its effects can last for many hours depending on preparation dosage, individual sensitivity, and other conditions. Visual perception can become intensified. Colors may appear brighter. Geometric patterns can emerge with closed or open eyes. Surfaces may seem to move or breathe. Sounds can feel unusually layered. Memories and emotions can become vivid. Some people experience changes in the sense of time, body boundaries, personal identity, or connection to the surrounding environment. Physical effects can include nausea, increased heart rate changes in temperature perception, and other forms of discomfort. The experience is therefore not automatically pleasant, and this is an important point when considering ritual use. A substance capable of producing awe can also produce fear. That combination may be central to its ceremonial power. Many rituals around the world are not designed simply to comfort participants. They may instead create controlled encounters with danger, uncertainty, transformation, or the unknown. A plant that changes ordinary perception for hours could become especially potent when surrounded by expectation music, darkness, fasting, chanting, movement, restricted access, or authoritative religious interpretation. The substance alone does not create the ritual. The environment around it gives the experience social meaning. This is where modern assumptions can become misleading. It is easy to imagine ancient psychoactive use as a primitive version of recreational drug consumption, but the comparison is often inappropriate. In traditional ceremonial settings, the plant may be treated less as an intoxicant than as a medicine teacher, sacred agent or instrument of diagnosis. Its effects can be embedded within systems of healing and divination. The person consuming it may not be seeking entertainment at all. Instead, the experience can be understood as difficult work requiring preparation, guidance, and interpretation. Ethnographic accounts from much later Andean traditions show that cactus ceremonies can involve healing, the identification of spiritual causes of illness, divination, protection, and attempts to restore balance. These later traditions cannot simply be projected backward thousands of years. The societies responsible for Chavin art lived in different political, linguistic, and religious worlds. Colonial rule later transformed Andean belief systems profoundly. Still living traditions demonstrate one important possibility: a psychoactive cactus can function within highly structured ritual systems without being reduced to intoxication. Its ecology may have strengthened this role. San Pedro and related cacti grow across parts of the Andean region, but not everywhere in equal abundance. Access to particular plants could therefore involve movement between ecological zones, trade relationships, or specialist knowledge about where useful specimens grew. Ancient Andean societies were already accustomed to obtaining valued resources across dramatic changes in altitude. Marine shells from tropical waters traveled far into the mountains. Obsidian moved between distant geological sources and settlements. Feathers, pigments, coca leaves, metals, and other materials could circulate over long routes. A psychoactive cactus could participate in these same networks of exchange. If certain ritual centers controlled access to plants, preparations, or knowledge, the cactus could acquire political significance as well as spiritual meaning. The power would not lie only in possessing the plant. Anyone living near it might be able to cut a stem. The greater authority could lie in knowing how to prepare it, when to consume it, what rituals should accompany it, and how to explain whatever visions or sensations followed. Specialists could claim expertise over an experience that was intensely personal, but socially interpreted. There is another subtle feature of the cactus that may have encouraged symbolic meaning. Its form is repetitive and geometric. Vertical ribs run the length of the stem, creating star-like shapes when viewed in cross-section. New branches emerge and rise upward. Flowers can appear dramatically from an otherwise severe body. To ancient artists already interested in transformation, symmetry, animals, plants, and supernatural forms, the cactus offered a visually distinctive object that could be represented clearly enough to remain recognizable in stone and ceramic. Recognizability becomes crucial later. Archaeologists are often forced to debate whether an ancient plant image represents a specific species or merely a stylized botanical form. With San Pedro imagery, some examples are unusually suggestive because the columnar shape and ribbed structure resemble the living cactus closely. Even then, caution is necessary. Artistic conventions are not botanical illustrations, and ancient artists did not work according to modern scientific taxonomy. Still, the convergence is difficult to ignore. Here is a plant naturally adapted to one of the most dramatic environments inhabited by ancient Andean communities. It remains green through dryness, grows into imposing vertical forms, contains a compound capable of profoundly altering consciousness, and can be prepared within rituals that turn physiological effects into experiences of healing, danger, transformation, or revelation. None of those qualities alone prove sacred status. Together, they make it easier to understand why the cactus could cross the boundary between useful vegetation and ritual object. The deeper mystery is when that crossing occurred. Humans may have known the plant for thousands of years before anyone carved it into ceremonial art. They may have eaten it, tested it, treated wounds with it, transported it, cultivated it, or avoided it long before its psychoactive effects became institutionally important. Archaeology can occasionally recover fragments of plants, residues, seeds, pollen, and artistic representations, but the earliest stages of human experimentation are almost always the hardest to see. And that is where the record becomes frustrating. The cactus appears ancient enough to suggest a very long relationship with people, yet the first traces do not arrive with labels explaining their purpose. Before the evidence becomes spectacular, it is incomplete, scattered, and ambiguous, the kind of evidence that invites interpretation but refuses certainty. The oldest traces of cactus use do not arrive as a dramatic discovery. There is no single grave temple or vessel that marks the moment when people first understood what the plant could do. Instead, the record appears gradually in fragments that are difficult to interpret without caution. Archaeologists find botanical remains in ancient settlements, plant fibers in ritual contexts, images that may depict columnar cacti, and evidence that people were moving useful species across ecological zones long before written history began. The pattern suggests familiarity, but familiarity is not the same as ceremonial use. A cactus can be eaten, applied, medicinally planted near a settlement, carried as trade material, or collected for practical reasons without ever becoming sacred. This simple problem lies at the heart of the earliest evidence. The dry environments of coastal Peru sometimes preserve organic material exceptionally well. In places where rainfall is limited and decomposition slows, archaeologists can recover plant remains that would disappear completely in wetter regions. Ancient baskets, seeds, fibers, food scraps, wooden tools, and fragments of cultivated plants may survive for thousands of years. This preservation gives the Andes an unusually detailed botanical record, but even here the evidence is incomplete. A piece of cactus tissue does not preserve the intention of the person who handled it. Context becomes everything. If cactus remains appear beside cooking debris, the most cautious interpretation may be ordinary plant use. If they are found in association with ceremonial objects, burials, restricted architecture, or unusual deposits, ritual explanations become more plausible. Yet archaeological sites are complicated. Objects can be moved after deposition. Buildings can change function. Later people can reuse earlier spaces. A plant discarded casually may end up near a sacred structure simply because both occupied the same settlement for generations. For this reason, scholars rarely treat one botanical fragment as decisive proof of ritual activity. The problem becomes even more difficult because columnar cacti had multiple potential uses. Different species could provide moisture, edible fruit fuel in some circumstances, living barriers, construction material when dried, or medicine. Certain cacti also contain psychoactive alkaloids, but the presence of such chemistry does not prove that every ancient community used them for altered states. People may know a plant intimately, while exploiting only some of its properties. Knowledge can also be uneven. One valley may develop a specialized ceremonial tradition, while a neighboring community treats the same species as an ordinary medicinal resource. What survives in the record therefore suggests a long human relationship with cactus before archaeologists can confidently describe the nature of that relationship. Some archaeological discussions have proposed very early dates for the use of psychoactive San Pedro in Peru, extending several millennia before the height of Chavin. Such claims are intriguing, but the interpretation depends heavily on context and identification. Ancient plant fragments are not always preserved well enough to determine species with absolute confidence, and even when identification is secure, purpose remains harder to establish. There is also the possibility that knowledge of the cactus developed independently in multiple places. The Andes are not a single ecological or cultural zone. Coastal valleys, western slopes, highland basins, and eastern environments contain radically different resources. Communities exchanged goods across these regions, but they also developed distinct traditions. Someone living beside a natural population of columnar cactus might encounter its properties directly. Elsewhere, the plant may arrive as an unusual imported substance, already surrounded by stories and ritual significance. This movement matters because ancient Andean societies were remarkably skilled at linking environments together. Even before large states emerged, communities exchanged materials over considerable distances. Shells from warm northern waters appear far from their original coast. Obsidian can be traced to specific mountain sources hundreds of kilometers from where finished tools are found. Cotton from lower valleys, high-altitude animal products, pigments, feathers, and cultivated crops move through networks that existed long before imperial road systems. The cactus could travel through the same social landscape. A transported plant is not just biological material. It can carry reputation. If one community believes that a particular cactus heals, reveals hidden information, or connects specialists with supernatural forces, people elsewhere may value it not because they have independently discovered its chemistry, but because they have inherited a cultural explanation for its effects. This is one way ritual traditions spread without requiring mass migration. Objects move, practices move, stories move, and eventually meanings become embedded in places far from where they began. Yet archaeologists face a frustrating imbalance. Durable objects survive better than experiences. Stone tools, architecture, ceramic vessels, and carved images can remain for thousands of years. Ritual gestures, songs, fasting practices, methods of preparation, and the emotional meaning of altered consciousness vanish unless they leave some indirect physical trace. A ceremonial drink might be consumed completely. A cactus preparation could be boiled in a container later washed and reused. A participant may experience hours of intense visions without leaving any archaeological evidence at all. Even chemical residue analysis, one of the most promising modern tools, has limitations. Molecules degrade. Contamination can occur. Some compounds preserve better than others. Archaeologists also need an appropriate object to test, such as a vessel inhalation tube spoon container or human biological material. If a psychoactive cactus was prepared in perishable containers or consumed in ways that left little residue, its use might remain invisible even when it was culturally important. That invisibility creates temptation. Once later cultures clearly represent cactus in ceremonial imagery, it becomes easy to read earlier traces backward and assume continuity. But continuity should not be automatic. A plant can change meaning over centuries. A medicine can become sacred. A sacred substance can become ordinary. A local practice can become institutionalized. The evidence remains incomplete precisely because cultural transformation rarely leaves a clean boundary. The earlier stages may therefore resemble a long period of experimentation rather than a single invention. Generations observe the cactus test, its properties, learn appropriate preparation, discover the consequences of different amounts, and attach explanations to unusual experiences. Knowledge becomes refined. Certain individuals may become recognized as specialists. A plant once encountered in daily life can gradually acquire ceremonial rules around who may gather it when it should be prepared, and how its effects should be understood. One lesser-known possibility is that the dramatic bitterness and physical discomfort associated with many mescaline-containing cacti may itself have reinforced ritual seriousness. Consuming such a preparation is not necessarily easy. Nausea and prolonged bodily effect can make the experience demanding. In a ceremonial framework, difficulty can become meaningful. Endurance may signal commitment, purification, or the crossing of a threshold. But this remains interpretation rather than direct evidence from the earliest periods. For centuries, perhaps millennia, the trail stays hazy. The cactus exists in the human landscape, but its precise role slips between archaeology and inference. Then something changes. Ancient artists begin making the plant visible. Instead of relying only on botanical fragments whose meaning is uncertain, researchers encounter images in which the cactus seems deliberately placed beside powerful beings and ceremonial figures. The plant moves from the margins of the archaeological record toward the center of religious imagery, and once it is carved into stone, the mystery becomes much harder to dismiss. The moment the cactus enters ancient art, the problem changes. Plant remains can prove that people handled a species, but images reveal that they considered it worth showing. In the ancient Andes, this distinction matters because visual art was rarely decorative in the modern sense. Ceramics carved, stone textiles, metalwork, and architecture carried information about status, ritual, ancestry, animals, supernatural beings, and relationships between worlds. When a distinctive plant appears repeatedly within that visual language, especially beside beings marked as powerful or otherworldly, it becomes much harder to treat the plant as an accidental detail. Some of the most important clues emerge from artistic traditions associated with the northern and central Andes during the centuries before and during the rise of Chavin influence. Archaeologists often use the term cupisnique for a complex of styles and cultural developments concentrated largely along Peru's northern coast and nearby valleys during the first millennium before the Common Era. Cupisnique art is famous for tightly controlled compositions filled with felines, serpents, birds of prey, human-animal hybrids, and supernatural faces with exaggerated teeth and staring eyes. The imagery does not provide a written theology, but it makes one thing clear: transformation occupies an important place in this symbolic world. Among these images are depictions interpreted by many researchers as columnar cactus. The identification is not based merely on the presence of a generic green plant, because ancient ceramics obviously do not preserve natural color in a straightforward way. Instead, scholars look at form. The plant is shown as a thick, upright stem divided by longitudinal ribs, sometimes branching in ways strongly reminiscent of San Pedro and related Andean cacti. In certain representations, the cactus appears alongside anthropomorphic figures, whose faces, teeth, claws, or postures suggest beings outside ordinary human experience. This association is striking, but it must be handled carefully. A person holding a cactus does not automatically represent someone hallucinating, nor does a supernatural figure prove that the artist was attempting to illustrate a psychedelic vision. Religious systems throughout human history create composite beings without pharmacological assistance. Jaguars can represent predation authority, night wilderness, or sacred power. Serpents can evoke water fertility, danger movement, or transformation. Birds may connect earthly and celestial realms. The symbolism can operate on several levels at once. Even so, when a psychoactive plant appears inside this visual universe, the possibility of ritual use becomes much stronger. The cactus is no longer simply present in the environment. It is selected, stylized, and placed in a context already charged with sacred meaning. This is the earliest visual evidence that allows archaeologists to ask not only whether ancient people knew the plant, but whether they had begun incorporating it into ceremonies concerned with transformation and supernatural authority. Cupisnique imagery is especially valuable because it also demonstrates that the visual language later associated with Chavin did not materialize from nothing. Long before Chavin de Huántar reached its greatest importance, northern and central Andean communities were experimenting with related symbols. fanged faces, powerful animals, curling serpents, and complex hybrid bodies circulate across regional traditions. The similarities do not necessarily mean that a single religion controlled all these communities. They may instead reflect exchange networks in which symbols, ritual practices, specialists, and prestigious objects traveled between valleys. A cactus could move through exactly such networks. Unlike monumental architecture, which remains fixed in one place, a plant or prepared substance is portable. So are ceramic vessels showing it. A traveller can carry cuttings. A ritual specialist can carry knowledge. A pilgrim can return home with stories about an unfamiliar ceremony. Over generations, the plant may become associated with a wider symbolic system in which access to altered states, animal powers, and sacred places becomes interconnected. The artistic evidence grows more dramatic within the tradition usually called Chavin. Chavin-style imagery spreads widely across parts of Peru during the first millennium before the Common Era, though scholars continue to debate whether this reflects religion, prestige, exchange, pilgrimage, political influence, shared elite culture, or some combination of these forces. The style is visually unmistakable. Bodies transform into patterns, human faces acquire feline fangs, hair becomes serpents, animals merge with one another, eyes appear in unexpected places. Forms can be intentionally difficult to read, requiring the viewer to rotate an object or trace a line before recognizing what is represented. This ambiguity may itself have been meaningful. The viewer is forced to look twice. A shape that appears to be one creature becomes another. Human and animal categories refuse to stay stable. The imagery seems built around the possibility that identity is not fixed. For researchers interested in psychoactive ritual, this has obvious significance because altered states can include sensations of bodily transformation, intensified pattern recognition, and the collapse of ordinary boundaries. Yet the resemblance must not be overstated. Chavin artists could deliberately construct visual ambiguity for theological or political reasons, entirely independent of psychoactive experience. The cactus nevertheless appears within this same symbolic environment, and that is difficult to ignore. One of the reasons scholars take the identification seriously is that the plant's distinctive ribbed columnar form remains recognizable even within highly stylized compositions. Ancient artists capable of turning jaguars, serpents, birds, and humans into complex visual puzzles could still make certain botanical elements clear enough to identify. There may also have been practical reasons for emphasizing the cactus visually. Plants are difficult symbols unless they have distinctive forms. A leaf can resemble countless species. A flower may be stylized beyond recognition. A tall ribbed cactus, however, has a recognizable silhouette. Its repeated vertical ribs and branching growth create a visual signature. If ritual specialists wanted audiences to associate a particular plant with sacred authority, it was unusually well suited to representation. Another intriguing detail is that cactus imagery does not generally appear as background vegetation decorating landscapes. Ancient Andean art rarely portrays scenery in the naturalistic manner familiar from later European painting. When plants are included, they're usually isolated and meaningful. A cactus shown in the hand of a figure is therefore not equivalent to a tree painted behind a modern portrait. The act of holding it establishes a relationship between the figure and the plant. What that relationship meant remains uncertain. The figure might be a ritual specialist, a supernatural being, an ancestor, a deity, or a transformed human. The cactus might signify consumption, possession, knowledge, healing, fertility, or access to sacred power. Scholars still debate these possibilities because images preserve associations more readily than explanations. Ancient viewers may have understood immediately what the plant signified, while modern researchers are left reconstructing meaning from context. This is the great frustration of prehistoric iconography. The closer an image brings us to ancient thought, the more clearly we become aware of what is missing. The cactus can be seen, the fangs can be counted, the serpents can be traced, the stone or ceramic can be dated. But the story ancient people told when they looked at the image has disappeared. Then at Chavindawanta, the visual clues are placed inside a physical environment, unlike almost anything that came before. The cactus is no longer encountered only on portable objects or isolated imagery. It enters a ceremonial center built from stone, water, darkness, sound, and controlled movement, a place where the architecture itself seems capable of transforming perception. Chavindawanta does not reveal itself like an ordinary settlement. It sits high in the Peruvian Andes in a narrow mountain valley where rivers meet beneath steep slopes and distant peaks. The location alone would have demanded effort from anyone approaching it. Pilgrims traveling from lower valleys or more distant regions would have climbed through dramatically changing landscapes, leaving warmer environments behind as the air thinned and the mountains closed in around them. By the time they reached the ceremonial center, the journey itself may already have felt like a movement away from everyday life. Chavin was not merely a collection of buildings. It was a place carefully positioned within a powerful landscape, and much of its architecture seems designed to intensify that sense of crossing into something different. The monumental complex developed over centuries with temples, plazas, stairways, platforms, internal galleries, drainage systems, and carved stone monuments added or modified through time. Archaeologists still debate the exact chronology of individual construction phases, but the overall result is unmistakable. Visitors entering the site would encounter massive stone walls and open ceremonial spaces before being drawn towards structures containing dark, narrow passages. Some of these internal galleries form networks of corridors and chambers hidden within the architecture. They are not simply rooms with roofs. They create a world of confinement. Darkness turns limited visibility and controlled movement. Inside such spaces, ordinary perception changes even without psychoactive substances. Sunlight disappears rapidly. The temperature shifts. A person can no longer see the surrounding mountains or judge direction by the sky. Stone walls close in. Footsteps become more noticeable. Sounds travel strangely through corridors. In some areas, small openings and ventilation shafts provide narrow connections to the outside, but the visitor remains enclosed within a deliberately constructed environment. Anyone unfamiliar with the internal layout would depend on those who knew the route. That dependence may have been essential. Chavin's architecture could separate ritual specialists from ordinary visitors and control who entered particular spaces. Not everyone approaching the temple necessarily experienced the same ceremony. Large plazas could hold groups while interior galleries permitted much smaller numbers. Restricted access creates hierarchy almost automatically. A person allowed into a hidden corridor possesses an experience unavailable to someone left outside. A specialist who knows where the passage leads controls both movement and expectation. The most famous object inside this labyrinth is the lanzon, a tall carved stone monolith positioned deep within the old temple. Its surface depicts an extraordinary anthropomorphic being with fangs, claw-like features, elaborate hair or serpentine forms, and an expression difficult to reduce to any familiar creature. The stone rises more than 4 meters and is wedged into the structure so that it seems almost fused with the temple itself. Anyone approaching it through the galleries would not have encountered it in bright museum lighting. The original experience would have unfolded in dimness, probably by limited artificial light or carefully directed natural illumination. The figure's placement matters as much as its imagery. To reach it, a participant moves inward. The visible world narrows. The monumental mountains outside disappear behind stone. At the center stands something that seems neither fully human nor fully animal. Archaeologists cannot know exactly what the Lanzon represented, and interpretations range from a major deity to an ancestral or cosmological being. What survives in the record suggests that the monument occupied a position of exceptional ritual importance. Sound may have made the experience even stranger. Chavin contains an elaborate system of stone-lined canals and drains, some running beneath buildings. During periods when water moved through these channels, the sound could have resonated through the architecture. Researchers have experimented with how water and other noises may have travelled through the site, although claims that the temple functioned as a precisely engineered acoustic machine should be treated cautiously. Still, even modest echoes, rushing water shell trumpets, footsteps and voices would behave differently inside narrow stone corridors than they would in an open plaza. Conch shell trumpets, known from archaeological finds at Chavin, add another layer. Large marine shells came from tropical waters far from the Highland Temple, demonstrating long-distance connections and the value placed on exotic materials. When blown, such shells produce deep penetrating tones capable of carrying across open spaces and reverberating inside enclosed ones. A pilgrim who had travelled days or weeks to reach Chavin could therefore encounter not only unfamiliar architecture but unfamiliar sound emerging from objects brought from distant seas. The sensory environment may have included smell as well. Fires burning, plant material, food preparation, human bodies. Damp stone and ceremonial substances would all shape an interior experience that modern visitors encounter only faintly. Darkness reduces visual information and makes other senses more important. In narrow spaces, even small sounds or odors can become intense. If a participant entered after fasting, sleep disruption, physical exertion, or consuming psychoactive plants, the effects of the architecture could become still more powerful. This possibility has led some researchers to describe Chavin as a place where ritual specialists deliberately manipulated perception. The idea is plausible, but it should not be exaggerated into the image of ancient technicians scientifically designing hallucinations. There is no surviving blueprint describing a sensory program, and no single explanation fully accounts for every gallery, canal, carving, and ritual object. Some features certainly served practical structural or drainage purposes. Others may have acquired ceremonial meanings only after construction. Ancient architecture often combines engineering, symbolism, and ritual without fitting neatly into one modern category. Yet the cumulative effect is difficult to dismiss. Chavin brings together restricted spaces, powerful iconography, unusual sound, exotic objects, controlled movement, and evidence that altered states may have played a role in ceremonies. The environment appears capable of making visitors feel physically disoriented and socially dependent on those directing them. A ritual specialist did not need to convince a participant through argument alone. The temple itself could demonstrate authority. This becomes especially important in a society without evidence for a large standing army or imperial bureaucracy centered at Chavin. Influence may instead have depended heavily on reputation. Pilgrimage shared religious symbols, specialist knowledge, and the ability to create experiences that visitors considered extraordinary. A person arriving from a distant valley might return home carrying not only objects or symbols, but memories of entering a mountain temple where darkness, sound, architecture, and ritual transformed the ordinary senses. And somewhere within this carefully controlled ceremonial world, the cactus appears again not as an uncertain botanical fragment, but held openly in the hand of a carved figure placed in one of Chavin's most important ritual spaces. Among the carved stones of Chavin de Huantar, one image has become almost inseparable from the mystery of the cactus. It comes from the circular plaza, a sunken ceremonial space positioned in front of the temple complex where carved stone slabs once formed part of an elaborate visual program. On one of these slabs appears an anthropomorphic figure holding a long-ribbed plant in one hand. The figure is unmistakably strange. It combines human proportions with features that belong to the wider Chavin world of transformation: an imposing face, exaggerated teeth, elaborate hair or serpentine elements, and a posture that feels ceremonial rather than ordinary. Yet what has drawn generations of attention is not only the figure, it is the object being carried. The plant is tall and columnar. Its surface is divided by vertical ribs. Its general shape closely resembles San Pedro and related mescaline-containing cacti of the Andes. For archaeologists interested in ancient psychoactive ritual, this image is one of the most important visual clues in the entire region, because the cactus is not carved as background vegetation. It is deliberately held. The figure and plant are connected through gesture. That distinction is crucial. Ancient Andean artists rarely filled stone reliefs with realistic landscapes. Individual plants, animals, and objects are usually included because they carry symbolic weight. When a figure holds something, the object often forms part of the figure's identity, authority, or ritual activity. A weapon identifies a warrior differently from a vessel, a staff, or an agricultural implement. In the same way, a cactus carried by a supernatural or ceremonially transformed being strongly suggests that the plant possesses a role within the symbolic system represented. Exactly what role remains unresolved. The popular interpretation is straightforward. The figure represents a priest-shaman deity, or transformed ritual specialist using San Pedro to enter an altered state. The plant's known psychoactive chemistry makes that conclusion tempting. Chavin imagery is already filled with hybrid bodies, staring eyes, serpentine forms, and transformations between human and animal characteristics. The temple itself contains dark galleries and sensory environments capable of amplifying unusual experiences. Seen together, the carving can look almost like an ancient declaration that cactus-induced vision was part of Chavin religion. But archaeology rarely offers such simple declarations. The carved figure does not show the cactus being consumed. There is no cup being raised to the mouth, no preparation vessel clearly connected to the scene, and no written label explaining the act. The plant might signify ritual knowledge without depicting actual ingestion. It might symbolize healing, fertility, divine power, access to certain landscapes, or a particular supernatural identity. The figure itself might not be human at all in the way modern viewers imagine. If it represents a deity, the cactus could function as an attribute much as later. Religious art associates specific beings with particular objects. This is why the carving is powerful evidence but not complete proof. Its location strengthens the case for ceremonial importance. The circular plaza was not an ordinary domestic courtyard. It formed part of a monumental complex where architecture, carved imagery, processions, and restricted spaces shaped ritual behavior. A cactus shown there participates in an environment already separated from daily household life. The carving therefore tells us that the plant belonged at minimum to the visual vocabulary of a major ceremonial institution. The figure's appearance adds another layer. Chavin art repeatedly destabilizes the boundary between human and animal. Fangs appear in human mouths. Hair transforms into serpentine forms. Eyes, claws, feathers, and predatory characteristics combine in ways that make biological categories seem fluid. Modern scholars have proposed many interpretations. Some see evidence of shamanic transformation. Others emphasize cosmology, elite identity, animal symbolism, or the deliberate construction of supernatural beings that express multiple forms of power. Scholars still debate how these interpretations relate to one another, and it is entirely possible that ancient viewers understood several meanings simultaneously. A psychoactive cactus could fit naturally into such a system, because altered states sometimes include sensations of bodily change, encounters with animals intensified visual patterning, and the impression that ordinary reality has become stable. But the similarity between visionary experience and Chavin imagery does not establish direct causation. Human beings can imagine hybrid creatures while completely sober. The danger lies in using modern knowledge of mescaline to explain every unusual ancient image, reducing a complex religion to pharmacology. The carving becomes more interesting when viewed not as an illustration of hallucination, but as evidence for control over a powerful plant. A ritual specialist holding the cactus may be presenting mastery rather than intoxication. The figure possesses the plant. It does not appear overwhelmed by it. This could suggest that ritual authority depended partly on expertise, knowing how to gather the cactus, how to prepare it, how much to use, when to use it, and how to interpret the experience it produced. Such knowledge would have had practical importance. Mescaline-containing cactus preparations can vary considerably in potency. Different plants contain different concentrations of active compounds, and preparation methods affect the final result. Ancient specialists would not have measured doses in laboratory units, but generations of experience could still produce sophisticated empirical knowledge. The thickness of a stem age of growth location, preparation time, and amount consumed might all become part of tradition. Mistakes could cause severe nausea, panic, or prolonged distress. Reliability would therefore strengthen the reputation of specialists able to guide participants through difficult experiences. The cactus bearer may also represent something more than an individual practitioner. It could embody the connection between the ceremonial center and landscapes beyond it. Plants grow in particular ecological zones. To bring them into a temple is to bring part of that landscape inside. The cactus can become a material link between dry mountain slopes and the sacred architecture of Chavin, just as tropical shells transported from distant seas connect the highland sanctuary with remote coasts. This pattern of gathering powerful materials from different environments is one of the most striking features of Andean ceremonial life. Exotic shells, unusual animals, valued stones, pigments, feathers, and plants could accumulate significance because they originated beyond the immediate world of a local community. Distance itself could contribute to prestige. A ritual center capable of drawing rare substances and pilgrims from multiple regions demonstrated connections that ordinary households did not possess. The cactus bearer therefore may symbolize networks as much as visions. The plant stands at the intersection of ecology, religion, knowledge, and authority. Its image says that someone at Chavin considered this particular form important enough to carve permanently into stone, and stone changes the scale of the evidence. Perishable rituals disappear, drinks are consumed, plant flesh decomposes, memories die with the people who carried them. But the cactus bearer remains holding the same ribbed stem century after century, silently preserving an association that ancient viewers probably understood without explanation. For a long time, researchers had to work mainly from images like this. The cactus seemed to point towards psychoactive ritual, but the interpretation depended heavily on iconography and analogy. Then, archaeology began recovering a different kind of evidence from Chavin's small objects associated with the direct consumption of psychoactive plants. Inside bone tubes and ritual paraphernalia, chemical traces survived that could be examined with modern methods, and those traces would transform the debate. The evidence recovered from Chavin's ritual paraphernalia changes the nature of the investigation because it moves beyond imagery and into chemistry. For decades, researchers could point to the cactus bearer, the strange hybrid figures, the dark galleries, and the architecture of controlled experience. But these clues remained open to interpretation. A carved plant can suggest ritual significance without proving consumption. A fanged supernatural figure can represent transformation without documenting its cause. Chemical residues preserved inside ancient implements offer something different. They can reveal that particular psychoactive plants were physically present in objects used by real people, turning an argument about symbolism into evidence of behavior. Some of the most revealing objects are small tubes fashioned from animal bone. These were not large drinking vessels and were not designed for ordinary food preparation. Their shapes and archaeological context suggest that they formed part of a toolkit for administering finely prepared substances, probably through the nose. In parts of ancient South America, inhaling powdered psychoactive material has a long history, and specialized tubes, trays, spoons, and containers are known from several cultural traditions. At Chavin, the presence of such objects inside restricted ceremonial environments immediately raises the possibility that participants were not merely drinking ritual preparations. Some substances may have been introduced through the nasal passages, producing effects more rapidly and intensely. Modern analysis has made it possible to investigate microscopic traces left inside these implements. Researchers can search for chemical signatures and minute botanical particles that survive long after the original powders have disappeared. The results from Chavin have identified evidence associated with tobacco and with Anadinanthera, the plant commonly connected with preparations known in various South American traditions as vilca or sebel. Both can produce powerful physiological and psychological effects, although they do so through very different chemical pathways. The tobacco involved should not be imagined simply as the mild commercial product familiar today. South American Nicotiana species can contain substantial concentrations of nicotine and other alkaloids, and traditional preparations may be much stronger than modern casual smoking suggests. Tobacco has served medicinal, ceremonial, purifying, and divinatory functions in many indigenous American traditions. Depending on species and dose, concentrated preparations can cause dizziness, nausea, trembling, altered attention, and intense bodily sensations. In a controlled ritual environment, these effects could be interpreted as signs of purification, communication, or spiritual transition. Anadinanthera is even more significant to discussions of altered consciousness. Its seeds can contain potent tryptamine compounds capable of producing strong visionary effects when appropriately processed and administered. Archaeological evidence for Anadinanthera-based snuffs appears across parts of South America, sometimes accompanied by elaborate inhalation equipment. Its detection at Chavin therefore places the ceremonial center within a much broader tradition, in which psychoactive plants were deliberately prepared with specialized knowledge rather than encountered accidentally. This matters enormously. It confirms that at least some people associated with Chavin's restricted ritual spaces were handling psychoactive substances in ways requiring equipment, preparation, and learned technique. Whatever the exact religious interpretation, this is no longer merely a hypothesis derived from unusual art. Altered states were materially connected to the ceremonial environment. The locations of the paraphernalia make the discovery even more suggestive. These objects were associated with internal spaces rather than ordinary domestic contexts. That pattern supports the idea that psychoactive consumption could have been restricted, perhaps reserved for ritual specialists or selected participants, rather than offered indiscriminately to everyone who visited the center. Archaeologists cannot reconstruct the admission rules, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the combination of controlled architecture and specialized drug-taking equipment points toward organized practice. Such organization changes how Chavin's power can be understood. Imagine a pilgrim arriving after a difficult journey through the mountains. The visitor has already entered a place filled with unfamiliar images, monumental stonework, deep shell trumpet tones, enclosed passageways, and specialists who know routes through spaces outsiders cannot easily navigate. If a psychoactive substance is then administered, its effects do not occur in a neutral environment. The temple supplies the setting through which every unusual sensation can be interpreted. A sudden change in perception inside an ordinary field would be one thing. The same change inside a dark gallery beneath a massive ceremonial complex could feel entirely different. Sounds might become enormous. Carved faces could seem unstable in flickering light. The loss of normal spatial orientation could intensify. An individual experiencing fear or disorientation would depend heavily on ritual specialists who appeared to understand what was happening. Those specialists could explain the experience, direct it, and determine its meaning. This does not require imagining deliberate deception. The people guiding the ceremonies may have believed completely in the religious system they represented. Ancient ritual authority does not need to be reduced to manipulation in the cynical modern sense. A specialist can sincerely believe that a plant provides access to supernatural forces while simultaneously gaining status because others depend upon that specialist's knowledge. Religious conviction and social power are not mutually exclusive. The inhalation method itself also reveals a level of preparation that is easy to overlook. Psychoactive seeds cannot necessarily be used effectively by simply crushing and consuming them without knowledge. Traditional processing can involve roasting, grinding, mixing with alkaline substances or other techniques that alter how compounds become available to the body. Such practices are learned through experimentation and transmitted culturally. A successful ritual therefore contains generations of accumulated botanical knowledge hidden behind what might appear archaeologically as only a small bone tube. This specialized expertise may explain why certain substances become instruments of authority. The raw plant grows somewhere in the landscape, but the meaningful experience requires knowledge. Someone must identify the correct species, harvest it at the appropriate stage, prepare it safely, store it, transport it, administer it, and interpret the results. Each step creates opportunities for specialist control. There is also a geographical dimension. Anadenanthera does not naturally dominate the high-altitude environment around Chavin itself. Its presence indicates connections with ecological regions where the plant could be obtained. Like tropical marine shells found at the ceremonial center, psychoactive botanical materials reveal that Chavin participated in networks reaching beyond its immediate mountain valley. Sacred power may have been assembled from distant environments, shells from warm seas, feathers and plants from lower regions, stones and animals from the highlands, each carrying associations with places most visitors would never see. The surprising result is that the strongest direct evidence for psychoactive consumption at Chavin does not come from the famous cactus. It comes from other plants. That distinction is essential. Tobacco and Anadenanthera residues strengthen the argument that altered states formed part of ceremonial activity at the site. They make the cactus bearer far more difficult to dismiss as an isolated artistic curiosity. Yet they do not automatically prove that San Pedro was consumed in the same ceremonies. Archaeology must resist filling one gap with evidence from another. The temple now presents an intriguing contradiction. On its stone surfaces, the psychoactive cactus appears openly enough to be recognized thousands of years later. Inside its ritual equipment, chemistry confirms the use of other consciousness-altering plants. The two lines of evidence come remarkably close to meeting, but they do not quite touch. And in that narrow space between them lies the most important uncertainty in the entire mystery. The closer the evidence comes to proving San Pedro consumption at Chavin, the more important the remaining gap becomes. Archaeology is often most difficult precisely at this point, when several clues seem to converge so neatly that certainty feels almost irresistible. Chavin possesses unmistakable imagery of a ribbed columnar cactus. It contains ceremonial spaces capable of intensifying altered perception. It has produced specialized paraphernalia carrying residues from psychoactive tobacco and anaden anthera. Its art repeatedly explores transformation predatory animals, serpentine forms and identities that seem to move between human and supernatural categories. Taken together, these discoveries make psychoactive ritual at the site highly plausible. Yet plausibility is not the same as direct demonstration, and the famous cactus still occupies an uncomfortable position between what archaeology can show and what modern interpretation would like it to show. The problem is surprisingly simple. Researchers have evidence that a cactus resembling San Pedro was symbolically important at Chavin, but that is not the same as recovering mescaline from a vessel or implement securely associated with its consumption. The chemical confirmation available for other psychoactive plants therefore cannot be transferred automatically to the cactus. If tobacco and vilca were used, it proves that Chavin ritual specialists possessed knowledge of consciousness-altering substances. It does not prove that every psychoactive plant shown in Chavin imagery was consumed in the same manner during the same ceremonies or even by the same participants. This may feel overly cautious, but such distinctions protect the ancient evidence from becoming a story written by modern expectations. Once the label psychedelic temple is attached to a site, nearly every unusual feature begins to look like supporting evidence. Dark corridors become hallucination chambers. Hybrid creatures become visions. Acoustic effects become deliberate techniques for intensifying intoxication. The cactus bearer becomes a portrait of drug use. Each interpretation may contain part of the truth, yet combining them without qualification can create a level of certainty the archaeology itself does not possess. There are many reasons direct cactus evidence might be absent, even if San Pedro was consumed. The first is preservation. Mescaline and related chemical compounds do not survive indefinitely in every archaeological environment. Thousands of years of moisture changes microorganisms, mineral activity, cleaning, reuse, and burial can erase residues that were once present. A ceramic cup used repeatedly for cactus preparation might later be washed, repurposed, broken, scattered, and exposed to conditions that leave little chemically recoverable material. The second problem is the vessel itself. Cactus preparations need not have been administered through durable bone tubes like powdered snuffs. They could have been boiled in containers that have not survived, poured into vessels whose contents cannot now be identified or consumed from gourds, wooden cups, textiles, or other organic objects vulnerable to decay. If preparation occurred outside the monumental core, and only the finished liquid entered the temple, the archaeological trace could be distributed across several locations, rather than concentrated in one obvious ritual deposit. There is also the possibility that the cactus was used differently from later traditions. Modern and historically documented San Pedro ceremonies often involve a liquid preparation, but assuming identical methods thousands of years earlier would be risky. Ancient specialists may have developed forms of processing that left different traces. Portions of the plant could have been chewed dried, mixed with other ingredients applied medicinally, burned, carried symbolically, or used in ways that have no exact modern equivalent. The evidence remains incomplete because ritual practice is rarely preserved as a complete recipe. On the other hand, absence of residue cannot be turned into proof of use either. This is where archaeological reasoning must remain disciplined. It is valid to say that missing chemical evidence does not rule out cactus consumption. It is not valid to say that because preservation is imperfect consumption, therefore definitely occurred. One statement recognizes a limitation. The other fills the limitation with assumption. The cactus bearer itself presents the same challenge. Its resemblance to San Pedro is persuasive, and the ceremonial context makes the plant significant. But images can operate symbolically without depicting ordinary behavior. A later religious painting might show a saint holding an object associated with martyrdom, without implying that every worshipper physically uses that object during a ceremony. Ancient Chavin imagery may likewise assign the cactus a theological meaning larger than its practical consumption. Perhaps the plant signified the capacity to transform. Perhaps it marked ritual expertise. Perhaps its upright growth and remarkable endurance gave it associations with vitality. Perhaps its psychoactive effects were indeed central, and the image effectively identified beings or specialists connected with visionary practice. Several possibilities can remain true at once. Religious symbols rarely have only one meaning. Another uncertainty concerns who, if anyone, consumed psychoactive preparations. Popular reconstructions sometimes imagine crowds of pilgrims drinking cactus before entering the galleries, but the architecture does not require mass participation. Restricted interior spaces could accommodate only limited numbers. Psychoactive plants may have been consumed primarily by specialists, while other visitors witnessed ceremonies from plazas or participated in different ways. Alternatively, selected pilgrims may have undergone controlled initiation experiences. No surviving text tells us which model is correct. Dosage is equally unknowable. A plant can have ritual significance at amounts ranging from physiologically subtle to intensely visionary. Modern observers often assume that ancient psychoactive use was aimed at maximum hallucination, but this need not have been true. Small amounts might have been combined with fasting tobacco sensory restriction, exhaustion music, or expectation to create effects that participants considered meaningful. The ceremony could have depended on the interaction between substances and environment, rather than on overwhelming pharmacological intensity. There is even uncertainty over whether every cactus represented in early Andean art contained the same concentrations of mescaline found in particular modern specimens. Chemical content varies between species, individual plants, growing conditions, and plant tissues. Ancient people could have recognized these differences through experience, but archaeology rarely preserves enough botanical detail to reconstruct potency. These limitations do not weaken the mystery. In some ways, they make it more revealing. Chavin shows how easily archaeological interpretation can approach the edge of certainty without crossing it. The evidence is strong enough to establish that psychoactive substances were part of the ceremonial world. It is strong enough to establish that a recognizable columnar cactus held symbolic importance. What it cannot yet do is place a vessel in an ancient participant's hands, identify mescaline inside it, and reconstruct exactly what happened afterward. That missing moment matters because it prevents the temple from becoming a simple story about ancient drugs. The real subject is larger: how people created extraordinary experiences from plants, architecture, sound, darkness, symbols, social expectation, and specialist knowledge. Even if direct evidence for San Pedro consumption were discovered tomorrow, the chemistry alone would still not explain what participants believed they encountered. And that leads toward a deeper possibility. Perhaps the most important power of the ritual was never contained entirely inside the cactus. Perhaps it emerged from the carefully constructed relationship between the plant, the temple, the people who controlled access to both, and the meaning imposed on everything a participant experienced. If the cactus was only one ingredient in a much larger ceremonial system, then the architecture of Chavin begins to look less like a backdrop and more like part of the ritual technology itself. The point was not simply to consume a powerful plant and wait for visions. The experience could be shaped from the moment a visitor approached the ceremonial center, long before any substance entered the body. Distance, altitude, exhaustion, expectation, sound, darkness, restriction, unfamiliar imagery, and the authority of specialists all work together. By the time altered perception began, the participant may already have been psychologically prepared to understand whatever happened as something sacred. This kind of preparation is important because psychoactive experiences are never produced by chemistry alone. Modern research often emphasizes the role of setting expectation and social context in shaping how altered states unfold. Ancient people did not describe these factors in modern psychological language, but they did not need to. Generations of ritual practice could reveal that the same plant produced very different experiences depending on where it was consumed, who supervised the ceremony, what participants expected, and what sensory environment surrounded them. At Chavin, that environment was unusually controlled. A visitor entering a narrow gallery could lose sight of the sky within moments. Familiar orientation disappeared. The mountains, rivers, and open plazas outside were replaced by darkness, cold stone, and restricted movement. If the visitor had never entered the passages before, there was no easy way to know what lay around the next corner. The people guiding the ceremony possessed that knowledge. This simple asymmetry gave ritual specialists an enormous advantage. They knew the architecture while the participant did not. Sound could amplify the effect. The deep notes of conch shell trumpets, water moving through channels, footsteps, voices, and echoes could become difficult to locate within enclosed spaces. In darkness, the brain relies more heavily on sound to establish position and distance. If perception was already altered by tobacco, vilca, cactus, fasting, fatigue, or some combination of these factors, a single low tone emerging from an unseen corridor might become overwhelming. The participant could experience the temple not as architecture, but as something alive. Light could be controlled just as effectively. Bright sunlight in the high Andes can be intense, especially when reflected from pale stone. Moving suddenly from that brightness into a dim interior forces the eyes to adjust. Figures carved into the walls might first appear as indistinct forms and only gradually become visible. Flickering torchlight or small shafts of daylight could cause shadows to shift across faces already designed to blur human and animal features. The art did not need to move physically. Under the right conditions, the viewer's perception could make it seem unstable. The famous Chavin tendency toward visual ambiguity may have worked especially well in such circumstances. A carving can appear to contain one creature when viewed from one direction, and another when traced differently. Teeth become claws, hair becomes serpents, bodies dissolve into repeated patterns. In ordinary daylight, this complexity is intellectually challenging. In darkness, under stress or intoxication, it may have felt far more immediate. The participant could experience transformation not as an abstract theological idea, but as something unfolding directly before the eyes. This is one reason scholars have suggested that Chavin ceremonies may have functioned as controlled initiations. The term should be used cautiously, because no surviving document describes an initiation sequence, but the architecture fits a pattern in which access becomes progressively restricted. A large group might gather in an open plaza, while only selected individuals enter deeper spaces. Those who emerge can claim an experience unavailable to those who remained outside. Mystery becomes socially powerful precisely because it is not shared equally. The authority created by such rituals would not necessarily resemble the power of a king commanding soldiers. Chavin may have operated through a different mechanism, one based on prestige, pilgrimage, specialized knowledge, and the reputation of the ceremonial center. People could travel great distances because they believed something extraordinary happened there. Ritual specialists who successfully guided visitors through frightening or transformative experiences might gain influence without maintaining a conventional empire. This possibility helps explain why psychoactive plants and monumental architecture matter together. A plant alone is difficult to monopolize if it grows naturally across wide areas. A temple, however, can control the interpretation of the experience. It can teach participants what the visions mean, which beings are encountered, what dangers must be overcome, and which specialists possess the knowledge to navigate the encounter safely. The substance may open perception, but the institution provides the map. That map could reinforce hierarchy. Imagine a participant emerging from the galleries after hours of disorientation and intense sensory experience. The ritual specialists appear calm because they know the passages, the sounds, the timing, and the expected effects of the substances involved. Their composure could seem supernatural. A person who felt temporarily unable to distinguish ordinary perception from vision might conclude that the specialist genuinely controlled forces beyond ordinary human understanding. Again, this does not require deliberate trickery. The specialists themselves may have undergone the same rituals and believed deeply in the beings and powers represented by Chavin art. A religious system can be sincere while also reinforcing social authority. In fact, sincerity may make it more effective. If everyone involved believes that the ritual opens access to dangerous or sacred realms, specialized guidance becomes genuinely valuable within that worldview. The preparation of psychoactive substances could strengthen this authority further. Knowledge of potency, timing, combination, and dosage would matter enormously. A poorly prepared plant might produce no effect. Too much could cause panic or severe physical discomfort. Tobacco and Anna-Dinenthera required their own techniques. Cactus preparations may have varied in strength. Specialists able to produce repeatable experiences would appear highly skilled, and that skill could be passed through restricted traditions rather than shared openly. There is also the question of selection. Not every pilgrim may have been considered suitable for the deepest rituals. Age, status, lineage, training offerings, or previous participation might have determined access. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists cannot reconstruct these rules with confidence, but restricted galleries make some form of differentiation likely. Chavin was physically capable of separating audiences. A lesser-known consequence of this system is that participants did not necessarily need to consume a strong psychoactive dose to experience something extraordinary. Sensory deprivation, exhaustion, fasting, repetitive sound, fear, expectation, and unfamiliar ritual environments can themselves alter attention and perception. Combined with even moderate pharmacological effects, they could create a powerful state without requiring the extreme intoxication often imagined in popular reconstructions. This broader perspective prevents the cactus from becoming an easy explanation for everything. The plant may have mattered profoundly, but Chavin's ritual power was probably built from layers: stone-shaped movement, darkness-shaped perception, sound-shaped emotion, specialist-shaped interpretation. Psychoactive substances may have intensified all of it, and once the senses were destabilized, the strange beings carved throughout the temple became something more than decoration. Jaguars, serpents, claws, fangs, and human bodies that refuse to remain human begin to occupy the center of the mystery because they may preserve the closest surviving visual language for what transformation meant inside this ancient ceremonial world. The creatures covering Chavin stone rarely remain what they first appear to be. A human face sprouts feline fangs, hair turns into serpents, hands end in claws, birds, cats, snakes, and people fold into one another until the boundary between species becomes difficult to locate. Even experienced viewers can struggle to determine where one body ends and another begins. This visual instability has made Chavin one of the most discussed artistic traditions in ancient South America, and it has also placed the site at the center of a difficult question. Were these strange beings attempts to represent experiences produced by psychoactive plants, or do they belong to a symbolic system that can be understood without them? The jaguar stands near the heart of that debate. Large cats carried extraordinary significance across many ancient American cultures. In the tropical forests east of the Andes, the jaguar is a powerful predator, capable of moving almost silently through dense vegetation, swimming rivers, climbing when necessary, and hunting in darkness. Its strength and ability to appear suddenly make it an obvious candidate for supernatural associations. Even communities living far from jaguar habitat could know the animal through trade stories, skins, teeth, and contact with people from lower ecological zones. At Chavin, feline traits appear repeatedly. Fangs protrude from otherwise human mouths. Clawed feet and hands transform figures that seem partly anthropomorphic. The effect is not simply decorative. Human identity seems deliberately mixed with the physical attributes of dangerous animals. Some scholars interpret this as evidence for ritual transformation, perhaps involving specialists who believed they could acquire the powers of jaguars or enter states in which their human identity temporarily changed. Such ideas are not unique to the Andes. Across many societies, ritual specialists have been associated with animals considered powerful, dangerous, or capable of moving between different environments. A predator active at night can become linked with hidden knowledge. A bird soaring above the ground can become a symbol of access to the sky. A serpent disappearing into cracks or shedding its skin can evoke regeneration, underground forces, or transformation. Ancient people did not need psychoactive substances to build these associations, yet altered states can make them feel immediate. Mescaline and other psychoactive compounds can affect body perception, visual processing, emotional intensity, and the sense of personal identity. Under certain conditions, a participant may experience the impression of becoming part of the surrounding environment or merging with another being. Animal imagery encountered during such states can feel unusually vivid. If a ritual tradition already teaches that jaguars, serpents, or birds possess sacred qualities, an altered experience could be interpreted through those established categories rather than appearing as meaningless sensory distortion. This may help explain why Chavin art is so carefully structured rather than chaotic. If the carvings were simply attempts to copy hallucinations, one might expect highly individual and unpredictable imagery. Instead, Chavin artists repeatedly use recognizable conventions. Fangs appear in particular ways. Serpents occupy particular positions. Eyes, claws, feathers, and mouths are arranged according to an established visual grammar that suggests training, shared symbolism, and rules. Whatever experiences inspired the imagery artist were not merely recording random visions. They were translating ideas into a controlled religious language. The serpent is especially important because it can function both as an animal and as a line. Chavin artists exploit the long, flexible shape of snakes to transform hair, eyebrows, belts, or other body parts into living creatures. A viewer may initially see a decorative curve and then realize that it possesses an eye and mouth. This creates a moment of perceptual reversal. The image changes without physically changing at all. Some researchers have suggested that such visual ambiguity resonates with altered states, when patterns can seem unstable, and familiar objects may take on unexpected forms. The comparison is intriguing, especially when considered alongside evidence for psychoactive ritual. But scholars still debate how far the connection can be taken. Complex visual puzzles can serve theological purposes regardless of drugs. They can also distinguish insiders from outsiders. Someone trained in Chavin symbolism may recognize layers of meaning that an inexperienced visitor misses entirely. That possibility turns the art itself into a form of specialized knowledge. The ability to read a carving could become another demonstration of authority. A pilgrim sees an overwhelming supernatural creature. A ritual specialist explains that the creature contains a jaguar serpent bird and humans simultaneously, each representing particular forces. The specialist does not merely guide the participant through physical galleries, he or she also guides the participant through symbolic ones. Transformation might therefore operate on several levels at once. A person can transform psychologically through ritual. A human figure can transform visually into an animal. A visitor can transform socially by completing an initiation. A plant can transform from ordinary cactus into sacred medicine through preparation. Even the temple transforms depending on where a person is allowed to go. Chavin repeatedly blurs categories that appear stable outside the ceremonial setting. One of the most striking examples comes from the carved heads once embedded along the exterior walls of the temple, often called Tinan heads. Many are damaged or missing today, but surviving examples display a range of strange faces. Some appear relatively human. Others have swollen features, prominent nostrils, mucus-like forms, fangs, and increasingly animal characteristics. This sequence has sometimes been interpreted as showing stages of psychoactive transformation. It is an attractive idea, but the evidence does not permit certainty. The heads were not necessarily arranged as a chronological sequence of intoxication, and features interpreted as physiological effects may have symbolic explanations instead. Popular accounts sometimes claim that particular carvings clearly document mucus discharge caused by hallucinogenic snuffs, but such readings remain disputed. No single explanation fully accounts for every face. What the heads do show, beyond doubt, is an obsession with unstable identity. Human anatomy is repeatedly pushed towards something else. Whether that something represents deity, ancestor, animal power, ritual specialist, altered consciousness, or several concepts combined, Chavin refuses to treat the human form as fixed. That may be the deeper connection to psychoactive ritual. The cactus and other substances need not explain the specific design of every fang or serpent. Their importance may instead lie in creating experiences that made transformation believable. If a participant felt the ordinary body dissolve, saw patterns moving in stone, heard sounds without visible sources, and entered spaces controlled by people dressed or represented as hybrid beings, the religious claim that humans could cross boundaries might no longer seem metaphorical. The temple would not merely teach transformation, it could make transformation feel experienced, and this idea would outlast Chavin itself. Centuries after the great ceremonial center lost its former prominence, columnar cactus continues to appear in Andean imagery and ritual traditions. Different societies reshape its meaning, placing it into new political and religious worlds. The old symbols change, but the plant remains. Its journey is far from over. When Chavin de Huántar eventually loses its position as one of the great ceremonial centers of the Andes, the cactus does not disappear with it. Temples decline, pilgrimage routes change artistic styles, fracture into regional traditions, and new societies emerge with their own rulers, gods, burial customs, and political ambitions. Yet across parts of ancient Peru, the columnar cactus continues to surface in imagery and ritual contexts. Its survival is important because it suggests that whatever meaning the plant acquired during the first millennium, before the Common Era, was not confined to a single sanctuary. The cactus had entered a much larger cultural landscape, and later societies inherited, transformed, or reinvented its significance. This does not mean there was one unbroken religion stretching from Chavin into every later culture. The Andes were far too diverse for that. Political systems rose and collapsed independently, languages changed, communities migrated, trade networks expanded or contracted. New religious traditions absorbed older symbols while discarding others. A plant can survive all of these changes because it belongs to the landscape itself. People may abandon a temple, but the cactus continues growing on the hillsides. On Peru's northern coast, the Moche world offers some of the most intriguing later evidence. Flourishing roughly during the first millennium of the Common Era, Moche societies built enormous adobe ceremonial complexes, created highly detailed ceramics, developed elaborate irrigation systems, and buried some elites with extraordinary quantities of objects. Their art is unusually narrative compared with many earlier Andean traditions. Ceramic vessels depict warriors, prisoners, animals, healers, sexual activity, sacrifice, hunting, supernatural beings, and ritual performances with remarkable specificity. Columnar cacti also appear within this visual universe. In some Moche imagery, cactus forms are associated with figures interpreted as ritual specialists or supernatural actors. The precise meaning is not always clear, and scholars disagree over how confidently particular scenes can be identified as depictions of San Pedro ceremonies. Yet the plant's continued presence centuries after Chavin is significant. It suggests that columnar cactus remains more than an obscure botanical curiosity. The Moche environment also provides a useful reminder that ritual plants do not exist separately from politics. Moche ceremonial life could be intensely public and hierarchical. Monumental temples dominated irrigated valleys. Elite burials displayed enormous differences in wealth and status. Ritual sacrifice appears in both archaeological evidence and art. Religious specialists, rulers, warriors, and supernatural imagery were deeply intertwined. If psychoactive cactus had a ceremonial role in this world, its meaning may have differed substantially from whatever it represented at Chavin. A substance associated with healing in one community can become associated with elite ceremony in another. A plant used to communicate with supernatural forces can also be employed in divination, diagnosis, initiation, or funerary ritual. There is no reason to assume that the cactus retained one fixed meaning for 2,000 years. This is one of the most easily misunderstood aspects of ancient religious continuity. Symbols can survive while their explanations change completely. A later society may recognize an old sacred plant but attach it to new deities. A ritual specialist may inherit preparation techniques without inheriting the mythology that once surrounded them. Even the same ceremony can acquire new political meaning when performed under different institutions. The cactus therefore becomes a kind of cultural traveler. Its biological form remains stable enough to be recognized, but the human world around it changes repeatedly. Farther along the northern Peruvian coast, later traditions associated with Lambayeque or Sican develop after the decline of Moche political centers. These societies create their own monumental architecture, metalworking traditions, elite tombs, and religious imagery. The north coast becomes a landscape layered with centuries of ceremonial practice. Older sacred places can be reused. Older motifs can be adapted. healers and ritual specialists continue operating within societies that no longer resemble Chavin and only partly resemble the Moche world that preceded them. The precise role of psychoactive cactus in these later societies is difficult to reconstruct. Archaeological evidence becomes a mixture of imagery, botanical associations, colonial-era descriptions from much later periods, and comparison with living traditions. The temptation is to draw a straight line from Chavin to Moche to Lambayeque, to modern northern Peruvian curanderismo. But that line would conceal enormous historical transformations. Centuries separate these worlds. Conquests intervene, religions reorganize, populations move. Some practices may persist, others are probably reinvented. Still, the geographical continuity is striking. Northern Peru remains one of the regions most strongly associated with ceremonial San Pedro use into historical times. Later healers prepare cactus within ritual systems concerned with illness, divination, spiritual attack, protection, and the restoration of balance. These practices cannot be used as direct windows into Chavin religion, but they demonstrate how remarkably durable a plant-centered ritual tradition can become once botanical knowledge is embedded in social life. The cactus itself helps make such durability possible. Unlike a rare mineral deposit or imported shell species, it can be propagated. Cut sections can root and grow. Knowledge and plant material can therefore travel together. A healer moving to another valley does not need to carry a permanent supply. A living cutting can establish a new source. Over generations, cultivated populations may become part of settlements and ritual landscapes far from where individual plants were originally collected. This ability to reproduce through cuttings may have encouraged human management long before systematic botanical records exist. People could select particular plants because they were vigorous, less spiny, easier to prepare, or believed to possess stronger properties. Whether ancient communities deliberately selected cactus for psychoactive potency is extremely difficult to prove, but long-term human cultivation could have influenced which forms became most valued. The plant's physical persistence also gives it unusual symbolic potential. A cactus cutting taken from an old ceremonial place can continue living elsewhere. New growth emerges from a piece severed from an older stem. In societies concerned with ancestry regeneration and continuity, such qualities may have been noticed, although assigning a specific ancient symbolism to them remains speculative. What is less speculative is the repeated human decision to keep the cactus close. Across changing cultures, it continues to appear where medicine, ritual, supernatural authority, and transformation intersect. It survives political collapse because its knowledge does not depend on palaces. It can be carried by specialists maintained in gardens, exchanged between communities, and incorporated into new ceremonial systems. By the time later Andean traditions become visible through colonial records and ethnographic observation, the cactus exists within an extraordinarily complicated world of healing and divination. Its ceremonies are not simply about seeing strange images. They address sickness, misfortune, hidden enemies, spiritual danger, protection, and the uncertain boundary between what can be seen and what must be interpreted. The ancient cactus has travelled a long distance from the stone figure at Chavin, but one idea appears repeatedly along the way. Its value lies not only in changing perception, but in revealing something that ordinary perception supposedly cannot reach. By the time cactus rituals become visible in later Andean healing traditions, the plant exists within a world where illness is rarely understood as a purely physical event. A fever, pain, weakness, recurring misfortune, infertility, nightmares, sudden fear, or unexplained decline can be interpreted through several layers at once. The body matters, but so do relationships, places, emotions, ancestors, envy, spiritual forces, and breaches of social or ritual balance. Within such a worldview, a powerful cactus does not need to function as a drug in the modern recreational sense. Its purpose can be diagnostic, protective, therapeutic, and divinatory all at once. This distinction is essential for understanding why altered perception might be considered useful. If an illness has causes that cannot be seen directly, then ordinary eyesight is not enough. A healer requires another way of knowing. Cactus-induced changes in perception can be interpreted as a means of revealing hidden information, the origin of sickness, the presence of harmful influences, the intentions of enemies, the location of lost objects, or the correct path toward recovery. Whether such revelations correspond to anything measurable by modern medicine is a separate question. What matters historically is that participants could believe the altered state provided access to knowledge unavailable during ordinary consciousness. The healer therefore becomes more than a person who prepares a plant. The healer is an interpreter. That role creates enormous responsibility. A participant undergoing a long and sometimes physically difficult cactus experience may encounter fear, confusion, vivid memories, unusual patterns, bodily sensations, or emotionally intense thoughts. Without a shared framework, these effects could feel chaotic. Within ritual, however, they can be assigned meaning. A frightening image may become evidence of danger. A sensation of purification may be understood as illness leaving the body. A recurring memory may be interpreted as the source of emotional imbalance. The ceremony turns ambiguous experience into narrative. Music often helps structure that process in later traditions. Rhythmic sound songs, rattles, whistles, and other instruments can guide attention over many hours. Repetition creates continuity as the effects of the cactus rise and fall. Smell, smoke, perfumes, tobacco liquids, sacred objects, and carefully arranged ritual spaces may contribute additional layers. None of these details should be projected mechanically backward into Shavin ceremonies, yet they demonstrate an important principle. Psychoactive ritual is rarely just a person consuming a substance. It is an orchestrated environment in which every sensory element can become part of interpretation. Protection is another recurring theme. In traditional healing systems, sickness may be understood not only as internal disorder, but as something caused or intensified by external forces. Harm can come from envy, spiritual attack, dangerous places, offended beings, or contact with disruptive influences. A ceremony may therefore be defensive. The healer identifies threats, strengthens the patient, cleanses harmful effects, and establishes boundaries against whatever is believed to be causing trouble. This makes the cactus simultaneously medicine and instrument of detection. Its value lies not simply in producing visions, but in helping the specialist distinguish friend from enemy, health from danger, and ordinary misfortune from supernatural interference. Such beliefs are difficult to recover archaeologically because fear leaves almost no physical trace. A carved image can survive. The anxiety experienced by a participant disappears, yet fear may have been one of the strongest forces sustaining ritual authority. A person suffering from an unexplained illness is vulnerable. So is someone facing crop failure, repeated death within a household, political uncertainty, or signs interpreted as supernatural warning. In such moments, specialists who claim access to hidden knowledge gain enormous importance. If they possess rare plants, unusual instruments, restricted ritual spaces, and traditions unavailable to ordinary people, their authority can appear not merely social but necessary. This pattern may help explain why psychoactive knowledge can become intertwined with power. The specialist controls interpretation at moments when uncertainty is highest. A failed harvest can have many material causes, but a ritual system may identify a spiritual explanation. A sickness may improve naturally after a ceremony, strengthening belief in the healer's effectiveness. A prediction that later seems accurate enhances reputation. Over time, personal success becomes institutional prestige. At a place like Chavin, the scale could be much larger. Instead of one healer working with a family, a ceremonial institution may gather specialists capable of addressing communities, travelers, elites, and pilgrims from distant valleys. Architecture magnifies their authority. Monumental stone suggests permanence. Exotic materials suggest long-distance connections. Controlled access creates exclusivity. Psychoactive substances may then function within a system where sacred knowledge is concentrated in particular hands. But there is another side to such power. What heals can also frighten. Psychoactive experiences are not predictable in a simple way. Intense fear, nausea, disorientation, and loss of familiar identity can become part of the experience. In some ritual traditions, difficulty may be interpreted as a necessary confrontation with danger, illness, or hostile forces. A participant does not necessarily judge the ceremony by whether it felt pleasant. A frightening experience can be considered meaningful precisely because it seems to expose something hidden. Ancient Chavin imagery is filled with forms that would hardly qualify as comforting. Fangs, claws, staring eyes, snakes, predators, and transformed bodies dominate the visual language. If these images surrounded altered state rituals, they may have framed the experience around danger as much as revelation. Sacred power could be protective and threatening at the same time. This duality appears often in religious systems. The being capable of curing illness may also cause it. The specialist who protects a community may also be feared for possessing dangerous knowledge. A plant that provides insight may also overwhelm the unprepared. Such ambiguity can strengthen ritual authority because access to power becomes inseparable from the risk of misusing it. The cactus itself fits this pattern remarkably well. It is visually resilient, medicinally important in some traditions, chemically powerful, bitter to consume, and capable of producing both awe and discomfort. Its ritual identity need not be divided into separate categories of medicine, sacrament, and intoxicant. Ancient users may have experienced these categories as part of one continuous system. What survives in the record suggests that the most important function of cactus ritual was not escape from reality. It was an attempt to penetrate reality more deeply, at least as participants understood it. The altered state could be used to explain suffering, detect hidden causes, reinforce social authority, confront fear, and restore order to a world that often felt unpredictable. That complexity helps explain why the cactus survives cultural change. A plant used only for spectacle might disappear when a temple closes. A plant embedded in healing, protection, divination, and community knowledge can travel much further. Soon, however, that continuity encounters the most disruptive force yet: conquest, Christian conversion, and colonial rule. The ancient plant remains, but the language surrounding it begins to change. The arrival of Spanish rule in the Andes does not erase the cactus, but it changes the world around it so violently that almost every surviving ritual tradition is forced to adapt. Temples are destroyed or abandoned. Indigenous religious specialists lose authority. Christian institutions spread across former sacred landscapes, and colonial officials attempt to classify local beliefs according to categories they already understand. Practices connected with ancestral powers, divination, sacred landscapes, or non-Christian beings can be condemned as superstition, idolatry, sorcery, or the work of the devil. Yet suppression does not produce a clean break. Rituals move into new spaces. Old symbols acquire Christian names, and indigenous knowledge survives by changing its outward form. This is where the name San Pedro becomes especially revealing. In Spanish, San Pedro means Saint Peter the Apostle. traditionally associated in Christian belief with the keys to heaven. The symbolism is difficult to miss. A cactus that alters perception and is used in healing and divination becomes linked with the saint imagined as a keeper of heavenly access. The exact history of how and when this name became dominant is not perfectly documented, and scholars still debate the layers of indigenous and colonial meaning behind it, but the association illustrates how older ritual traditions could survive beneath a Christian vocabulary. The change of name does not mean the plant suddenly became Christian in a simple sense. Colonial Andean religion develops through centuries of negotiation, resistance, reinterpretation, and blending. Indigenous communities adopt Christian saints' festivals, crosses, prayers, and sacred images, while often preserving older relationships with mountains, ancestors, springs, fields, and healing practices. Missionaries may believe that conversion has replaced one worldview with another, while local people may understand the new symbols through patterns that long predate European arrival. A saint can therefore become connected to a place once associated with an older sacred power. A cross can be placed on a mountain without making the mountain spiritually unimportant. Christian prayers can enter a healing ceremony alongside plants whose use reaches far beyond the colonial period. This process is often described as syncretism, although the word can make a deeply uneven history sound more peaceful than it was. Colonial conversion was backed by political authority, punishment, forced labor systems, and campaigns against indigenous religion. Survival often required adaptation because open continuity could be dangerous. Cactus ritual was particularly vulnerable because altered states and divination fit poorly within official Christian doctrine. Clergy and colonial authorities frequently viewed indigenous specialists with suspicion, especially when they claimed knowledge obtained through visions, ancestral beings, or sacred plants. Such practices challenge the Church's effort to define legitimate supernatural authority. A healer who could diagnose hidden spiritual causes or communicate with non-Christian forces occupied a position that missionaries might see as competition, yet practical medicine complicated the situation. Colonial communities suffered from disease injury, malnutrition, epidemic outbreaks, and limited access to European-trained physicians. Indigenous botanical knowledge remained essential. Healers knew local plants in ways newly arrived colonists did not. Some remedies were adopted, others condemned, and many existed in a grey area where medical usefulness and ritual meaning could not easily be separated. The cactus survives partly within that ambiguity. It can be treated as medicine while carrying older ceremonial associations. A healer can invoke Christian figures without abandoning indigenous concepts of balance, spiritual danger, or sacred landscape. Over generations, ceremonies accumulate layers rather than replacing one system completely with another. This layering becomes visible in later northern Peruvian healing traditions. Christian crosses images of saints, prayers, swords, staffs, perfumes, tobacco shells, stones, and plants can occupy the same ritual world. From a strict theological perspective, these objects belong to different histories. Within the ceremony, however, they may function together. The result is not a fossilized survival of an untouched prehistoric religion. It is a living tradition constantly reorganized in response to conquest, colonialism, local experience, and changing social conditions. That distinction matters enormously when looking backward toward Chavin. The survival of cactus ritual into the colonial and modern periods demonstrates continuity in the importance of the plant, but it does not provide a direct translation of ancient beliefs. A 20th century healer invoking St. Peter cannot be assumed to practice the same religion as a Chavin specialist standing in a dark gallery more than 2,000 years earlier. The cactus may connect them biologically and ritually, while the meanings surrounding it have changed beyond recognition. Still, certain structural similarities are difficult to ignore. The plant remains associated with specialized knowledge. It remains linked with healing and divination. Its effects are interpreted through ritual rather than treated as random intoxication. Specialists guide participants. Ceremonial objects shape the experience. Invisible causes of illness or misfortune may be diagnosed through altered perception. These parallels do not prove uninterrupted continuity, but they reveal why the cactus could survive repeated historical transformations. There is also something remarkable about the plant's ability to carry multiple identities at once. It can be an indigenous sacred medicine and bear the name of a Christian saint. It can belong to local healing traditions while existing inside a colonial society that officially distrusts those traditions. It can be condemned by some religious authorities and tolerated by others when framed as medicine. It can survive because people do not need monumental temples to keep the knowledge alive. A cathedral can replace an ancient ceremonial complex. A political order can collapse. A priesthood can disappear. But a cactus cutting can remain in a household garden. That simple fact changes the scale of historical survival. Knowledge no longer depends on stone institutions. It can pass quietly between families, healers, apprentices, and communities. A preparation method can survive without written instructions. Ritual songs can change language. Christian names can replace older divine identities. New objects can enter the ceremony while older ones disappear. What remains constant is not a frozen ritual, but a capacity for adaptation. The colonial period therefore obscures as much as it preserves. Written accounts finally appear, but they are produced through the assumptions of outsiders who may misunderstand, condemn, or deliberately simplify what they witness. Indigenous practitioners themselves often leave far fewer written explanations. The first detailed historical descriptions do not necessarily capture the oldest meanings. What survives is a layered tradition. Beneath the name San Pedro lies a plant whose ceremonial history reaches far deeper than Christianity in the Andes. Yet by adopting a Christian name, the cactus becomes something new as well. It carries ancient botanical knowledge into a transformed religious world, proving that survival does not always mean resisting change. Sometimes survival means absorbing change, until the old practice can no longer be separated cleanly from everything that came after it. And that layered survival continues into the present, where living ceremonies still offer glimpses of what cactus ritual can mean, while reminding us how dangerous it is to mistake a modern echo for an exact voice from the ancient past. In northern Peru today, the cactus still enters ceremonies that would be recognizable in some broad ways to people who lived centuries ago, yet almost everything surrounding it has changed. The plant may be prepared as a bitter drink and consumed within healing rituals led by specialists often described as curanderos. Participants seek help for illness, emotional distress, misfortune, spiritual danger, uncertainty, or problems believed to have causes that ordinary observation cannot reveal. The cactus becomes part of a larger ceremonial system involving prayer objects, music, tobacco, perfumes, stones, staffs, crosses, and other materials gathered into carefully ordered ritual spaces. To modern observers, these ceremonies can appear to offer a living bridge back toward the ancient Andes. But that bridge is uneven, interrupted, and layered with centuries of change. The most striking continuity is the idea that the cactus provides a different way of seeing. In many traditional contexts, the altered state is not valued simply because perception becomes unusual. It is valued because unusual perception can be interpreted as useful. The healer may understand visions, bodily sensations, emotional reactions, or sudden associations as information. A participant's suffering can be examined symbolically as well as physically. The ceremony may seek to identify the source of illness, locate hidden conflict, reveal spiritual threats, or restore a sense of balance. This is important because it helps explain why psychoactive plants can remain culturally important long after political systems disappear. A temple requires labor wealth and institutional support. A healing tradition can survive with far less. It can continue in villages, households, agricultural communities, and networks of specialists. Knowledge can pass orally. Plants can be propagated locally. Ritual objects can change without destroying the underlying structure of the ceremony. Modern northern Peruvian cactus rituals often take place during the night. Darkness reduces ordinary visual distractions and can intensify the effects of both expectation and the psychoactive preparation. The ceremony may unfold slowly across many hours, allowing the participant to move through periods of nausea, heightened perception, introspection, fear, calm, and fatigue. The timing alone distinguishes the experience from casual intoxication. Participants enter a setting in which the effects are anticipated, guided, and interpreted. Sound becomes one of the main organizing forces. Songs, whistles, rattles, prayers, and repeated rhythmic patterns can provide structure when the sense of time becomes unstable. A participant may feel that hours have passed when only minutes have gone by, or lose track of ordinary sequence entirely. Repetition creates orientation. The healer controls tempo and attention, helping the ceremony maintain a recognizable shape, even when individual perception becomes unpredictable. Objects arranged before the healer may form what is often described as a mesa, a ritual working surface or ceremonial collection. The specific contents vary, but they can include stones, crosses, staffs, shells, images, bottles, blades, archaeological objects, animal materials, and items considered personally or spiritually powerful. Some have obvious Christian associations. Others reflect indigenous concepts or local histories. Still others may have been introduced recently. The mesa therefore resembles the cactus tradition itself, not a preserved relic from one ancient period, but an accumulation. This accumulation is exactly why modern practice must be used carefully when interpreting Chavin. It would be easy to see a contemporary healer working at night with San Pedro ritual objects, tobacco music, and divination, then project the entire ceremony backward 3,000 years. The resemblance can be seductive. Chavin also contains psychoactive substances, powerful objects, unusual sound-restricted ritual spaces, and imagery associated with transformation. Yet direct continuity cannot simply be assumed. Between the two worlds lie the Moshe Lambayeke, Chimu Inca expansion, Spanish conquest, Christian evangelization epidemics, colonial administration, forced cultural change, independence, modernization, and countless local transformations that left little written trace. A living ritual is not a museum. It adapts because people adapt. A healer incorporates new objects because those objects acquire meaning. Christian saints enter ceremonies because Christianity becomes part of local life. Bottles, metal tools, imported perfumes, printed images, and other materials can be added without making the tradition less meaningful to participants. What matters is not whether every element is ancient, but how the system continues to organize healing, danger protection, and knowledge. For archaeology, modern curanderismo is therefore most useful as a source of possibilities rather than answers. It demonstrates that cactus-based altered states can exist inside disciplined ceremonial frameworks. It shows that specialists can interpret visions as diagnostic information. It reveals how music, darkness, ritual objects, tobacco, and social expectation can interact with psychoactive effects. It proves that a plant can remain central while the religious language around it changes dramatically. What it cannot prove is that Chavin ceremonies worked in exactly the same way. The ancient temple may have involved collective pilgrimage more than individual healing. Cactus may have been consumed by specialists rather than patients. Visions may have been interpreted through deities and animal transformations that no longer survive. The timing, dosage, preparation, social rules, and purpose could have been entirely different. Even the word used for the plant at Chavin is lost. There is another danger in treating modern ceremonies as prehistoric survivals. It can unintentionally deny living communities their history. Present-day ritual specialists are not remnants frozen outside time. Their practices respond to contemporary illnesses, economics, religion, tourism, family traditions, urbanization, and changing attitudes toward indigenous medicine. A ceremony performed today belongs to today, even when it carries ancient elements. Yet the persistence of the cactus remains extraordinary. Across thousands of years of political upheaval, the plant has never needed a single empire to protect it. Its knowledge survives because it can be taught person to person. A cutting grows, a preparation is learned, a ritual is modified, a new saint can be added. An old symbol can disappear. The cactus continues to stand at the center because its biological effects remain powerful enough to be interpreted again and again. This persistence also helps illuminate the ancient archaeological record. When Chavin artists carved a ribbed cactus into stone, they were not selecting a plant whose unusual properties would soon be forgotten. They were participating in the human relationship with a species capable of surviving extraordinary cultural change. Whatever they believed about it, later generations repeatedly found new reasons to preserve its ceremonial importance. The modern ritual therefore offers neither a perfect answer nor a meaningless coincidence. It is an echo. Some frequencies may be ancient, others colonial, others recent. The original voice cannot be reconstructed simply by listening to what remains. But the echo confirms that the cactus has long possessed a rare cultural quality. It can survive the disappearance of the institutions that once interpreted it. And with that, the mystery returns to where it began, not simply to what the cactus does to the human brain, but to why generation after generation has chosen to treat those effects as something worthy of ritual memory and sacred attention. After thousands of years of images, ruins, chemical traces, living ceremonies, and changing interpretations, the mystery of the cactus remains strangely intact. Archaeology can now say far more than it once could. A distinctive columnar cactus appears in the sacred visual language of ancient Peru. At Chavin de Huántar, it is held deliberately by a powerful anthropomorphic figure inside one of the most important ceremonial environments of the early Andes. The same center contains restricted galleries, unusual acoustic conditions, imagery centered on transformation, and direct evidence for the ritual use of other psychoactive plants. Later, Andean societies continue to represent or ceremonially value columnar cactus, and northern Peruvian healing traditions preserve its use into the modern era. The individual pieces are no longer isolated. Together they form a compelling pattern, but the pattern does not produce a complete explanation. The strongest surviving evidence establishes association more easily than meaning. Archaeologists can identify a cactus in stone, but they cannot recover the thoughts of the person who carved it. Chemistry can demonstrate that psychoactive substances were handled at Chavin, but it cannot reconstruct the theology surrounding them. Architecture can reveal controlled passageways and restricted spaces, yet it cannot tell us precisely what a participant was instructed to believe while moving through them. Even modern San Pedro ceremonies, invaluable for understanding what cactus-centered ritual can look like, cannot simply restore the religious world of people who lived 3,000 years ago. This gap between evidence and experience is what makes the subject so enduring. At one extreme lies a cautious interpretation, in which the cactus is primarily a sacred botanical symbol, perhaps connected with healing fertility landscape or specialized ritual authority. Its psychoactive properties may have mattered, but the surviving images need not represent actual intoxication. At the other extreme lies the idea that visionary cactus ceremonies were central to Chavin religion, helping produce the transformed being's sensory experiences and institutional authority visible throughout the site. Between those positions are many possibilities, and no single explanation fully accounts for everything. The direct evidence for tobacco and Anadine anthera shifts the balance in an important way. It shows that psychoactive substances were not merely hypothetical within Chavin ceremonial life. Ritual specialists actually handled plants capable of profoundly changing perception. This makes the cactus imagery more significant than it would be at a site with no such evidence. Yet scientific discipline requires the final distinction to remain the use of one. Psychoactive plant does not automatically prove the consumption of another. Future discoveries could narrow that gap. New residue analyses may eventually identify mescaline or other cactus-related chemical markers in securely dated vessels or preparation equipment. Improved botanical techniques could distinguish ancient cactus species more precisely. Excavations might uncover preserved plant material from contexts directly connected to ritual spaces. Human remains could potentially provide additional information about diet or plant exposure, depending on preservation and ethical considerations. Archaeological science continues to extract information from materials that previous generations considered silent. But even perfect chemical confirmation would solve only part of the problem. Suppose researchers discover tomorrow that a vessel from Chavin unquestionably contained a mescaline-rich cactus preparation. It would establish consumption, but it would still not tell us whether the drink was considered medicine sacrament initiation, divination, purification communion with ancestors, contact with supernatural beings, or several of these things at once. It would not reveal whether visions were interpreted literally or symbolically. It would not identify who was allowed to drink, how often ceremonies occurred, or whether ordinary pilgrims and elite specialists experienced the plant differently. The deepest mystery is therefore not pharmacological. Mescaline is measurable, ancient meaning is not. That distinction protects Chavin from being reduced to the misleading image of an ancient psychedelic cult. The ceremonial center was vastly more complicated. It belonged to networks connecting coast mountains and distant ecological regions. Its builders manipulated stone-water sound movement and visibility with remarkable skill. Its artists created a visual system sophisticated enough to remain difficult to decode thousands of years later. Its influence spread across regions without leaving the simple political footprint of a conventional territorial empire. Psychoactive plants may have been one part of that achievement, possibly an important one, but they operated inside a cultural system much larger than any molecule. This also helps explain why the cactus persists after Chavin disappears. A purely institutional symbol might have vanished with the temple. Instead, the plant continues to be useful in new settings because its effect can be given new meanings. A healer can interpret them through medicine. A religious specialist can understand them as contact with sacred forces. A colonial-era practitioner can surround the cactus with Christian symbols. A modern participant can approach the same plant through indigenous tradition, spirituality, psychology, or combinations of all three. The chemistry remains relatively stable while the interpretation changes. That may be the most remarkable continuity of all. Human beings repeatedly encounter an altered state produced by a plant, and then construct explanations for what the experience means. The explanations reflect their worlds. Chavin imagery uses jaguars, serpents, fangs, and transformed bodies. Later societies develop different ceremonial languages. Colonial communities add saints and crosses. Modern science introduces receptors, alkaloids, and neurochemistry. None of these frameworks experiences the cactus in exactly the same way. The plant therefore becomes a mirror of cultural history. For ancient Andean people, it may have opened access to forces understood as genuinely present within the landscape and cosmos. For archaeologists, it provides evidence of sophisticated botanical knowledge and ritual practice. For neuroscientists, it contains compounds capable of altering perception through identifiable biological mechanisms. Each perspective answers certain questions while leaving others untouched. The stone cactus bearer at Chavin captures that unresolved tension perfectly. The figure still holds the plant after roughly 3,000 years. Its gesture is preserved with enough clarity that modern viewers recognize the cactus immediately, yet everything that once made the image obvious to an ancient observer has vanished. The words spoken during ceremonies are gone. The names of many supernatural beings are lost. The preparation methods are uncertain. The emotions of the participants cannot be excavated. What remains is a relationship, a human-like being, a sacred setting, and a plant with the power to change perception. That relationship is enough to show that the cactus mattered. It is not enough to tell us exactly why. And perhaps that is why the mystery has survived so well. The archaeological record can reveal the outline of an extraordinary tradition without returning the experience itself. Stone preserves the cactus. Chemistry preserves traces of altered consciousness. Living ritual preserves possibilities. But the ancient meaning remains just beyond reach, somewhere in the darkness of a temple gallery, where a participant once stood, listening to unseen sounds, watching familiar boundaries begin to dissolve. Word count 1089. The great ceremonial centers eventually fall quiet. Stones crack, rivers shift, roads lead somewhere else. The people who once knew exactly how to read the fanged faces and serpent forms disappear into generations whose names are never recorded. Yet on dry Andean slopes, green columns continue to rise from the earth. They endure drought almost patiently. A traveller passing them today can see something remarkably close to what ancient pilgrims saw thousands of years ago, thick ribs catching the highland light new growth pushing upward. Flowers appearing briefly against a severe landscape. The temples have changed. The languages have changed. The gods have changed. The plant remains. Perhaps that persistence is the most fitting ending to the story. Civilizations often leave behind monuments that seem permanent but are not. Walls collapse, religious systems fragment, symbols lose their meanings. Even powerful institutions can become ruins that later generations struggle to understand. A living plant survives differently. It does not preserve doctrine. It preserves possibility. Someone cuts a piece and carries it to another valley. Someone learns how to prepare it. Someone gives the practice a new name. Centuries later, another generation encounters the same bitterness, the same long hours of altered perception, and searches once again for an explanation. The cactus never tells them what the experience means. Human beings supply that part, and so the mystery remains suspended between stone and memory, chemistry and belief. Chavin's carved figure still holds its ribbed stem in silence. Modern science can identify the molecules hidden inside such plants, but it cannot recover the vanished world through which ancient people understood them. The mountains keep that final secret. Above the valleys, evening light fades from the stone. Shadows lengthen across ruined plazas. The old galleries grow dark again, just as they did thousands of years ago. Somewhere beyond them, on a dry slope beneath the Andes, a cactus stands quietly against the cooling sky, carrying no inscription, offering no explanation, and surviving long after the people who first made it sacred have disappeared.